Hey, Mike. Nice to be here with you again today.
Great to be with you, and in a slightly different format. But I'm excited. I'm excited for this, and
Yeah, me
we're on a
too.
little bit of a tighter time frame, so let's just jump right in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And we were just talking before we hit record just now about the word empowered. And I was just sharing that I feel like the word empowered is the word itself sort of feels a bit empowering. It feels a bit uplifting and makes us feel, bigger and stronger. But it's a word that's been really perhaps overused in the personal development space in a lot of different contexts. And I thought, well, what does it actually mean? And you come up with this idea as well, that um, there's some sort of elusive thing that we're trying to chase in terms of being empowered. Or what does it mean? How does it show up? What are we actually chasing if we're trying to be empowered? So that's kind of the idea, the topic that we're decided to jump into today. So I'd love to throw it over to you, Mike, to share what comes up for you when you hear that word empowered. What does it mean for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to like full disclosure here. I don't have this perfectly polished definition of what empowerment is, or that it's some sort of final destination that we arrive at. But the couple of things that immediately emerge for me are around alignment and agency, where we feel like we're taking some sort of intentional stance in our life, intentional action. So a lot of like a classic example of what it means to not be empowered is when we're like reactive and triggered, which is like part of being a human. It happens. And so yeah, we might get poked in a at a wound. Someone might be starting conflict with me in some way that I don't like. And so if I start to lash back out, that would not be empowerment to me. Empowerment would be me just owning my experience of, oh, I'm a little bit reactive, I'm a little bit triggered. And so empowerment is really, I feel like I'm using a lot of buzzwords here, but
Mhm.
there's a sort of presence and alignment and intentionality behind the way that we're being or the way that we are acting. And it is an overused word, but it's also why would we not want to act from agency and choice in our life? I mean, that's exactly I think what we're all looking for is to live a life that we have some sort of control over. What comes up for you around empowerment?
Yeah, I really appreciate your reflections, and to use another buzzword, I resonate with them a lot. That's a goodie. No, it's interesting because we don't often stop and really slow down to think what it really means when we're saying these words, but we are really linguistic beings. I refer back to that a lot, that we build our world with our language, and there's always sort of an unconscious interpretation of what these things mean. And it's from that place, I think, that these words are then used, within the certain contexts. Um, what comes up for me first, I have to reflect on this idea of what resides in our subconscious. So I
Mhm.
feel like empowerment has a lot to do with the extent to which we can sort of manage that communication between our conscious and unconscious minds. Because if there's something going on underneath, like you referred to, some sort of some trigger or something that happens out there, and we've got the response that happens, in here. What's the process of mediation that happens before we actually react or respond? And it's interesting because I had this bit of a theme with my clients lately, coming to me and saying, I want to not react anymore. I really want to be able to truly respond to things in life, but I just find myself immediately just going for it. Right? And I think empowerment is about that as well. It's about how do I actually take a little bit of space from what I'm interacting with, and process it through the conscious and the unconscious mind, so that I can respond. Um, so we can expand that concept in a lot of different ways, I guess. And there's different ways to use the word. You might talk about even the way that somebody expresses themselves physically, the clothes they wear, how they do their hair, the way that they show up in the world. you might say that that's also empowerment, empowering somebody to express a certain identity. That can also be a can of worms, right? As you can say, well, are they really empowered, or are they feeling an obligation from some place that they have to be a certain way, even if that certain way is to be very different to what the norms and standards might be. So there's a lot of different ways we can kind of look at this concept. There's a lot happening beneath the surface, I think, on this topic of empowerment, which is why I think it's fun to kind of riff on this, because it's something, like say, it's becoming a bit of a throwaway word, right? We just say it, you know, we're coaches, so we empower our clients. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think now that we've gotten into it a little bit, it usually takes us a couple minutes to warm up, and then we're like off to the races. And I think one of the reasons that empowerment is a word that might not land is that it's become this catch-all for so many different things. So like there's emotional awareness, there's emotional agility. It's like knowing what is happening in your inner world versus, well, what do I do with what's happening in my inner world? There's the action component of like, well, what am I doing with my life? It's great to know all these things about myself, but like where do I go with this? And empowerment, it can be this catch-all that there's just so much going on. And I guess I'm thinking this is a good opportunity for us to zoom into a couple of things that feel alive for us around, well, what are those things underneath empowerment? And so, yeah, I would love to talk about, another one of the things that we had maybe teed up to discuss today was around our physiology. What does it mean to be empowered and have the mind body connection? I think that's a way that if we're in touch with not just living from the neck up and our thoughts, but if we're in touch with our physiology, our intuition, that's really what it's all about. So I would love to hear back from you, and you were talking a little bit about why this topic feels alive for you, and why is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been something that's come really into my field. I think if you're in the personal development space, you're going to see this talked about a lot, the mind-body connection. But it's been particularly kind of alive in my world lately. The need to really stay connected to our physical body, so that we can tap into that level of intelligence that resides there. And I find what I naturally do, if I'm a little bit stressed and maybe I've got too much on my plate or too many things to think about, I like to use this phrase. I default to really a neck up way of operating. I become very, very mental, and I'm a verbal processor. I was raised in a family that talked about stuff a lot, and lots of really sort of deep and intense conversations. So it's my easy go-to. It's all just happening in my brain and in my mouth, and I forget to check in with my heart. And also with the gut, right? Because the gut is where we also produce a lot of these really important hormones and neurotransmitters that affect how we feel as well. I think it's that serotonin, I believe it's more than 80% of that is produced in the gut. We used to think it happened in their brain, but it's not the case. So yeah, it's just something that's really been in my sort of heightened awareness, the importance of staying connected to that body, and whether it's through breath or movement or meditation, even things like singing, allowing that the vibrational flows to move up, not needing to necessarily put language or some sort of linguistic framework around what you're interacting with, but just to feel it. And when we do that, we really connect ourselves back to something that is a lot more innate, really, the instincts, that deeper sense of intuition that we can only really hear if we slow down and really tune in with ourselves. And I feel like that's an important part of empowerment as well, because we need to feel empowered in how we live our lives and the choices we make, the things that we give our energy to. We need to have as much information as possible. And so if we are only neck up, we're missing out on all of that intelligence, all of that instinct, all of that intuition, everything that our nervous system is feeding back and offering us as information to help govern our lives, we're just ignoring all of that. And so I think it's such an important element, and it can feel really sort of soft and woo-woo and spiritual, but there's really so much science behind this now, and it's only growing. It's becoming a really interesting field for researchers to look into. There's a particular field of research that I mentioned to you earlier, Mike, was embodied cognition. So if anyone's sort of doubting the validity of this, just do a quick Google on embodied cognition, and you'll find all kinds of really, really interesting studies that talk about this idea of the impact of moving our body and how that affects our mental and emotional state, and therefore our level of empowerment. And the classic one that a lot of people know about is the research from Amy Cuddy about the power posing. You go and stand in the toilet with your hands up in the air for 2 minutes before you give a speech, and you'll feel empowered. Or the Wonder Woman with your hands on your hips. So that's one of the more famous studies, but there's so much else out there in that area, and it's such a fascinating topic, whether you're talking this mental, emotional well-being or high performance or anything in between.
I mean, it reminds me where I thought you were going, and before you said Amy Cuddy, was around Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which is he's one of the OGs and pioneers in this field. And if you read or have read The Body Keeps the Score, there is tons of science in there to substantiate and support what we're talking about. So it is not, the days of calling this spiritual and woo-woo hopefully are not much longer. Bessel van der Kolk wrote that book not very long ago. And I think a really concrete example for this might be, so just imagine like when you were a kid, there's a lot of us we categorize ourselves as like perfectionists or people pleasers. And a lot of times it's not just our biology that indicates that. There's certain ways or patterns that we had as children that were rewarded or were not rewarded. And so, like, for example, if you were the type of person who spoke up or spoke a lot at the dinner table, and one of your parents really yelled at you and came down on you for that, there was going to be some sort of physiological reaction that you had to that. So, and then you might have internalized the lesson that speaking up is not a good thing, and so I'm not going to speak up. And if you don't address that in your physiology, this is why The Body Keeps the Score is so popular. It's because if you try and kind of mindset bringing your way through all this stuff, it can be helpful to know that you aren't your thoughts. And there's lots of really beautiful things about mindfulness, but there's always going to be a part of you that tightens up when you are on your edge around, like, someone might yell at me if I speak up here. And so if you aren't intentional about it, the next thing you know, you're a 40-year-old who's gotten promoted to a certain level in the boardroom, and your heart is pounding before you want to say something at a meeting, and you have no idea why. And you're going, well, I know I'm not going to die. Your brain's going, you're fine. Like, you're going to be okay. Just take a couple of breaths. But your heart just will continue to pound if you don't do the work of, like, okay, let's just presence the fact that I'm really nervous right now. What is this all about? So in a lot of ways, empowerment starts with just identifying what has shaped the way that we are, and what am I really bringing with me into this boardroom or into this relationship. It's not, you're not ever really reacting to the thing that's happening in real time. To speak to your language around subconscious, like, your subconscious has lots of programming, which isn't even to go into your ancestry. And I have a theory that if you're Jewish, like, a lot of people who are Jewish, like myself, were worried a lot of the time because we have been persecuted for a lot of our history. If you go all the way back, and the Holocaust is relatively recently in history. So it makes sense for our wiring to have lots of fear and lots of worry and lots of trying to control situations, because so much of our history has been out of control. And so how this ties to empowerment is, well, let's identify that and note it. Let's bring it to the table and see what it's all about. And in terms of mind body connection, all of this, we might think about it most of the time, but it does live if you really presence it. Sadness or grief or anger, like, all of it, there's some sort of physiological reaction or we call it a phenomenon that's happening in your body. Like maybe your skin temperature gets warmer or colder, maybe you get tighter in certain areas. And bringing awareness to that is where empowerment really begins. Is just noticing, how do I default? What are my initial responses to things? And it reminds me of Viktor Frankl's quote: "Between stimulus and response, there's always your choice."
Absolutely. Yeah. I so love what you've shared there, Mike. I think it's super relevant. And I really appreciate that you specifically named that example of being Jewish, because I think that a lot of people relate to that, and also will have their own examples, right, of being perhaps a minority group, or a group that they feel like has been discriminated against for not just their lifetime, but also many lifetimes before, right? And there's a really interesting book called "It Didn't Start With You." I can't remember the name of the author, maybe you know it. But they also look at this particular topic, and it's Mark Wolin, I think it is.
I'm looking it up. It is Mark Wolin.
Yeah, good one. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting support behind these ideas, and it really is valid. And I think the process that you set out in terms of looking at your current day experience, and starting to look at where that resistance is, and where you're finding yourself a little bit stuck, and using that as the starting point to then work back, and taking into account the physiological layer as well. Because we can just look straight away, go back and look through all the stories of our past, and all the times that we were victims, but that doesn't really make us feel empowered. But if you start with what you're facing today, and then work back from there, then you can generally make some pretty big shifts if you start to question what's going on when you're having that experience. And as you said, it's not normally about what's happening in that moment. If it's hysterical, it's historical, and that old adage that I like to come back to. But I think there's just so much wisdom there, as you said, and when we really just be present with that experience, and be really, really honest about what we're experiencing, then we can start to interrupt those automatic circuits, and we can really, really start to shake things up a little bit, and create some new ways of being for ourselves. There's so much opportunity there, but the first step really is, every time, it really is looking at things honestly, and starting from where you are.
I always love you. You're good for at least one every conversation we have. One of these little quips that's very memorable. If it's hysterical, it's historical. That's very, very memorable. I love that. And I think we're coming up on time here. And I wanted to drop in. This feels relevant to me. And I don't know if it necessarily pertains exactly to the topic of the conversation, but and I've completely lost track of what I was going to say. I have no idea what I was just going to say. Do you have any closing thoughts, Anne?
You lost it. No.
I had something that was like, I need to say this. I totally say this, and then it just poof, gone. But we're coming up on 20 minutes anyway. Is what feels alive for you to close here?
Yeah, I know. I just so enjoyed jamming on this topic with you, Mike. It's as we started with this word embodied, there we go. Empowered is used so much now, especially in the personal development space. I know you'll find it several times on my website. But really questioning, what does that really mean? And in a practical sense, what is the process of becoming empowered, and what is it to be disempowered? I think sometimes looking at the opposites can also help. But it's just been great to jam on this with you, and see what's come out. And I think we've gone to some interesting places today. So thank you as always.
Thank you as always. It's always a pleasure to jam with you. Doing it in 20 minutes was an interesting challenge, but I think we did a decent job.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, thanks so much, Mike, and look forward to the next conversation soon.
Me too. Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Cheers. Thanks.